So the Biden and Harris administration just authorized for the military to use lethal force against civilians if there is unrest. Now, really quick before we jump into this video, I want to ask you guys for a favor. Right now, we're sitting at about 740,000 subscribers, and I cannot thank you guys enough for all of your support. It would be kind of cool to try to reach 800,000 subscribers before the end of the year. So if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. Just also double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you. And then also just send this around to other people that maybe you think would find value in this video. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a new order that came out, a new DoD directive, which was issued by the Biden and Harris administration, essentially authorizing for law enforcement agencies to request assistance from DoD and military units. And also through this DoD directive, there is an authorization for those agencies, for those units to use lethal force against civilians that maybe are engaging in what is conceived to be civil unrest or other types of activity, to where then the military units would be called in. What we're going to be talking about is DoD Directive 5240.01, and it's titled as the DoD Intelligence and Intelligence-Related Activities and Defense Intelligence Component Assistance to Law Enforcement Agencies and Other Civil Authorities. This was a directive issued on September 27th and has now made its rounds, and everybody's talking about what implications does this have, especially leading into a very uncertain time right now in our nation. As many of you are aware, we are now heading into an election. In just a few weeks now, we're going to have probably a very controversial election. And so it's going to be very interesting, and a lot of people have uncertainties about maybe how some of the things will play out going into the next few months. And so this is also concerning because then you have this directive coming out and in some ways authorizing for military units to engage in lethal force if they're called in to maybe stop some sort of civil unrest and maybe use lethal force against civilians. So in the general application, it talks about this issuance applies to OSD, the military departments, the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Joint Chiefs Staff, the combatant commands, the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Defense, the DoD field activities, and all other organizational entities within the DoD. So essentially that is just talking about all of the different aspects and all the different components of the DoD that this would apply to. It states that this issuance, this directive, does not apply to activities conducted by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It does not apply to things like humanitarian assistance, disaster readiness, response, and recovery. So there are some carve-outs. It talks about how this doesn't apply to certain units in certain circumstances like humanitarian assistance. But then it goes on to say that it is for the support of civil authorities or civilian law enforcement agencies conducted in accordance with the DoD directive, including when such support is provided by the Defense Intelligence Components units, personnel, or assets. So like I said, that is kind of the general principles aspect of the directive, saying what units this applies to and what circumstances this could apply to, and maybe who is required to operate under this directive. And now we're going to move to the 3.2 section, which talks about the permissible assistance. And I explained this kind of as the general what assistance can be provided under this directive. And it states that in accordance with the section 2.6 of the Executive Order 12333, as amended, the following defense intelligence component intelligence assistance to any federal department or agency, including the federal law enforcement agency, or to a state or local law enforcement agency when lives are in danger, are authorized, one, cooperating with the appropriate law enforcement agencies to protect the IC's employees, information, property, and facilities of any element, unless otherwise precluded by the law or the executive order, participating in law enforcement activities to investigate or prevent clandestine intelligence activities, and three, providing specialized equipment, technical knowledge, or assistance of expert personnel for use by any federal department or agency, or when lives are in danger, to support state or local law enforcement agencies who are requesting it. So again, this is talking about the type of authorization that is granted, what type of assistance can be provided, the DoD giving, certain units, the military giving certain units to potentially state or local law enforcement who are needing assistance for certain activities. This can be provided to them upon request. And then there seems to be kind of this catch-all provision in 3.2 in the, I believe, subsection 4, when it states that when lives are in danger, rendering any other lawful assistance to law enforcement agencies or other civil authorities provided such assistance is consistent with some of the other directives. So as we talked about, there's this kind of the general principle of who and what units this applies to, what DoD components this applies to, what type of assistance and authorities can be given to local and state law enforcement who are requesting them. And then when you look at the directive under 3.3, it talks about the levels of authority. And this is the section that has everybody very upset. It talks about what authority the DoD has, what authority they can give to the state and law enforcement, what type of lethal force they can engage in, and then also the types of approvals they would need to get to engage in that conduct. It states that subject to paragraph 3.1, defense intelligence components may provide personnel to assist a federal department or agency, including a federal law enforcement agency or a state or local law enforcement agency, when lives are in danger, in response to a request for such assistance in accordance with the following approval authorities. It states that A, the Secretary of Defense approval. So really that's the main one where you would need to get the Secretary of Defense to approve it. And then it goes on to say in this same section, when the Secretary of Defense, in what situations the Secretary of Defense controls and has to give the authorization. And the main one we need to focus on is that, subsection A, which states that provisions of personnel to support response efforts for civilian disturbances, which may also require presidential authorization. So when it comes to potential civil disturbances, civil unrest in which the DoD is being requested by state or local law enforcement or military units are being requested, there you would get authorization from the Secretary of Defense. That is the main overarching authority that you would have to get the authorization, potentially also the president to approve that. But that is authorizing military to be mobilized in those civil disturbances in that civil unrest situation. And then it talks about subsection C, and this is really the lethal force section that everyone's concerned about. It states that C, assistance in responding with assets with potential for lethality or any situation in which it is reasonably foreseeable that providing the requested assistance may involve the use of force that is likely to result in lethal force, including death or serious bodily injury. It also includes all support to civilian law enforcement officials in situations where a confrontation between civilian law enforcement and civilian individuals or groups is reasonably anticipated. So this is talking about the general authorization having to go through the Secretary of Defense, but it's saying that that authorization has to go through that office when you're dealing with these specific situations, when there is lethal force that is going to be engaged in by the DoD unit against civilians because of general unrest or some other things going on. And here it's almost authorizing or recognizing that lethal force is being used by those agencies. And then there's subsection D, which talks about provision or use of DoD unmanned systems. Essentially, that's talking about even unmanned systems being authorized, drones being authorized in these situations, getting approval for those, from the Secretary of Defense when you're dealing with these civil unrest situations. Now, even more concerning, which I see in this, which I'm not trying to glaze over the fact that it is very concerning that lethal force is authorized potentially in this directive, but also when you look at section 3.5, it talks about exigent circumstances. So really what that's talking about is if there is a situation where there is imminent fear of death or bodily injury or, severe risk potentially, in a situation in which it's, this assistance is being requested, they can mobilize and move and do this without the required Secretary of Defense approval, but they could only operate potentially for 72 hours, and then they would need to submit the approval required. But even that is concerning for 3 days. You could have a military unit or a DoD, agency or whatever operate for 72 hours without the required approvals in these types of civil unrest situations. So I wanted to bring this to your guys' attention because I know a lot of people are talking about it, circulating online. I wanted to give my additional take on this because of some of the other provisions that aren't being covered in the directive. I think really if this was ever to be used, we are in a very bad position in our nation where maybe they would be using this directive. And I think that would signal some larger issues going on in our nation. So again, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and comment down below. Make sure you share this video around so people have this information. Also, if you like this video, and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.